The intake form had a field for place of birth and a separate field for place of childhood. Most cadets left the second one blank, as if the distinction was a clerical nuisance someone had forgotten to remove from the template. I filled it in. Place of birth: Earth, Oslo Natal Center, 2198. Place of childhood: Waystation Vale 3, Deep Spur 7, Duvari Relay Network. The intake officer, a Cavathi clerk with amber-scaled forearms and the careful precision of someone who handled 200 applications a week, looked at the second field for a long moment. Not long enough to ask a question, just long enough for something to register and get filed away without comment. He stamped the form, slid it back, and told me orientation bay 6, 0700. I said thank you. He said the assessment uniform was in the locker assigned to my bunk number, and that human cadets historically found the collar sizing difficult. He said it without malice. It was a notation, not a warning. I thanked him again and carried my duffel to Bay 6. That was the first morning at Kethvar Station. I did not know then that the intake officer had flagged my childhood field in the intake log, or that the flag had sat unread in an administrative queue for 11 days, or that by the time anyone reviewed it, the question it might have raised would already be settled. I have thought about that a great deal since. Kethvar Station orbited a dead secondary in the Veth system, a slow rotation that kept its belly toward the star's cold remnant and its docking ring facing open space. It had been an interspecies combat assessment facility for 60 years. Before that, it had been a siege platform resupply post, and before that something older that nobody still living could name with any certainty. The bones of both older structures showed in the corridors, a ceiling rivet line that turned at a wrong angle, a floor gradient that suggested a hull slope no longer there. The station had been rebuilt around itself 3 times over and still couldn't quite commit to what it had become. I understood that quality immediately. I had grown up inside something similar. Waystation Vale 3 was a Duvari relay installation, a mid-chain link in a string of deep spur communications posts that stretched from Duvari primary space to the outer frontier survey zones. My parents had been hired as mechanical engineers on a 2-year maintenance contract when I was 14 months old. The contract renewed. The work was good. The Duvari station chief was decent, and there was no particular reason to leave. By the time I was 4, Vale 3 was the only home I had any real memory of. The station ran a crew of 12, counting my parents. 9 Duvari, 2 engineers, 2 communications specialists, a medic, a cook, 2 maintenance techs, and the chief, a quiet male named Oren Veth who had managed the post for 22 years and would manage it for 3 more before the collapse. My parents, and me. And Siv. Siv was the chief's daughter. She had arrived on the station 4 years before I did, the product of a custody arrangement that the Duvari civil system had resolved in the chief's favor after a long dispute with her birth house on the home world. The birth house had appealed. The appeal process in Duvari civil law was very long. So Siv stayed at Vale 3, waiting for a resolution that never came, growing up between relay terminals and maintenance corridors, and the particular silence that a deep spur installation accumulates when there is no other sound for 40 light years in any direction. She was a small child. All Duvari are slight in their early years, before the cartilage sets and the secondary structure fills in, and Siv had the extra fragility of a child raised without sufficient sunlight. Her skin the pale gold gray of old ivory, not the deeper amber of well-lit Duvari. Her eyes were large, Duvari large, with the wide iris that makes their young look perpetually startled. She was not startled. She was watching everything, all the time, cataloging the world with a precision that her father's engineers noticed and named and quietly competed over, each one convinced they would be the mentor she eventually chose. She chose me, not as a mentor, as the person closest to her in height. I have tried to explain this to people over the years, and most of them smile in a way that suggests they think I'm being modest. I'm not. The attachment was functional at the start. I was the only living thing in Vale 3 approximately her size, and children, any species of children, use proximity as a first principle. She followed me because I was there. I followed back because she was interesting, and because there was not a great deal else to do. What grew out of that is harder to describe. It was not a human-style sibling bond, though that is the word people reach for. It was more like the bond that forms between two organisms that have no choice, but to share a very small space in a very large emptiness for a very long time. You learn the other creature's rhythms. You learn what they fear and what calms them, what noise means trouble and what silence means safety. And eventually you stop needing words for most of it because the whole system runs below language. We were fluent in each other before either of us was fluent in the other's tongue. The station was not dangerous in the way that frontier posts in the adventure serials are dangerous. It was dangerous the way all isolated mechanical systems are dangerous, slowly, quietly, and without warning. The climate system cycled. The pressure seals required monitoring. The relay array attracted microdebris that had to be cleared at intervals, which meant suits, which meant tether protocols, which my father reviewed with me in the same tone he used for everything, methodical, complete, without drama. The evacuation procedures were printed on card stock and laminated and posted at 12 specific locations throughout the station. I had memorized all of them by the time I was 6. Sieve had memorized them by the time she was 9, not because anyone asked her to, but because she had seen me doing it and had concluded, correctly, that it was worth knowing. There was a cold side maintenance corridor on the station's lower ring, behind the secondary relay array, that nobody went to unless something was failing. The corridor ran along the outer hull and had 3 observation ports set into the wall at intervals, thick composite lenses the size of dinner plates, and if you pressed your face against them, you could see the dead secondary rotating in the dark below the station. A slow brown-gray sphere with no atmosphere and no light of its own, just reflected relay glow from the array above it. Sieve and I used to go there. Not often, there was no schedule. One of us would appear at the other's bunk door at some late-cycle hour with nothing to say, and the other would understand and pull on a jacket, and they would walk down together in the corridor's low amber emergency lighting, which was all that ever ran at that end of the station, and they would press their faces against the observation ports and look at the dead world below and not talk about much. I think we were doing what isolated children do, which is finding a place that makes their smallness feel intentional rather than accidental. The dead secondary was not threatening. It was just very large and very old and very quiet. Sitting with it made the size of the emptiness feel like a presence rather than an absence. It was the closest thing either of us had to something sacred. She called it the cold eye. I do not know if that was a Duvari word concept she was translating or something she invented. I never asked. Some things you don't pick apart. The years on Vale 3 were not dramatic in their texture. That is the thing that is hardest to convey to people who have not lived them. There was no single event, no defining crisis, no turning point around which the character of the experience organized itself. There were systems, and the systems required tending, and you tended them. There were schedules, and the schedules structured your days, and the structure was the point, not as a constraint but as the architecture of safety, the thing that meant nothing was going wrong because everything was being attended to. My father said once that the best kind of engineering was the kind you never had to talk about because it was always working, and I understood later that he meant that as a statement about life on a station, and not just the equipment. You made a good day by doing the 10,000 quiet things correctly. You measured your competence not by the crises you survived, but by the crises that never arrived because you had done the work to prevent them. That discipline built something in me that did not have a name until Rithek tried to put one on it on the mat. Something about staying with the thing. Something about not requiring the situation to be better than it was before you could function inside it. In a place where help was 40 light-years away, and the relay signal took 3 hours to make the round trip, you learned early that the gap between where you were and where you needed to be was yours to cross, and that the crossing was not an emergency but a task, and that tasks had steps, and that steps could be taken one at a time for as long as it required. I left Vale 3 when I was 18, when my parents' final contract ended, and the station's operational mandate was restructured under a new Duvari network authority that did not have a provision for human residential staff. The parting was quiet in the way that all partings are quiet when you have run out of ways to make them otherwise. Sieve stood in the docking bay with her father's hand on her shoulder and watched my parents and me board the transfer shuttle. She was 14. She did not cry. She was not built for crying in the human register, and she knew I understood that, and so what she did instead was hold up her right hand with 2 fingers extended, the Duvari gesture of relay acknowledgement, the one the communications specialists used when a signal was confirmed received, and I held mine up too, and then the docking clamp released and the bay doors closed, and that was that. I went back to Earth. I spent 4 years in a standard education progression, acquiring the certifications that allowed me to exist in a mainstream galactic community infrastructure, and I was competent at all of it and interested in none of it. Earth was loud and bright and full of people who had grown up surrounded by other people, and who found my quietness unsettling in a way they couldn't name. I ate in cafeterias surrounded by hundreds of people, and felt more isolated than I ever had in a station of 12. I slept in dormitories where the ambient noise of other humans was constant, and woke every morning with the faint, wrong note sensation of someone listening for a mechanical system that was not there. I applied to Kethvar on the 4th anniversary of my departure from Vale 3. The certification I was pursuing, Level 2 Frontier Extraction Specialist, required completion of the combat assessment track, because frontier extraction work involved environments where the assessment bodies could not guarantee your safety and required proof that you could guarantee it yourself. I had no particular interest in combat as a discipline. I had an interest in being authorized to work in the environments where Sieve now was. The war had come to deep spur 18 months after I left. A Kavathi expansion dispute, contested by 3 other species, had turned the outer relay chain into a transit zone for military operations, and most of the civilian installations had been evacuated or destroyed. Vale 3 had been evacuated. Orenveth had been dead for a year by then, a pressure seal, one of the old ones, the ones my father had flagged for replacement in his last maintenance report, and that the new authority had not gotten to. And Sieve had been in the care of a Duvari welfare system that was overwhelmed and undersupported, and was not, as best I could determine from 14 months of bureaucratic inquiry, entirely certain where she was. She was somewhere in the resettlement network. The network was large and slow, and its records were in a format I could not access from Earth because I did not hold a Duvari Civil Services credential. The Level 2 Frontier Extraction Specialist certification would give me a compact transit clearance that would. The fastest path to that credential ran through Kethvar's combat assessment track. This is what I knew when I walked into Orientation Bay 6 at 0700 on my first morning at the station. I did not tell any of this to Rithek Velsavor. He did not ask. The combat assessment track at Kethvar ran in cohorts of 12. My cohort was 11 Kavathi officer cadets and me. The Kavathi are a tall species. Adult males average 2.3 meters, adults females slightly less, with a bilateral symmetry that superficially resembles human structure but runs on different mechanics. The shoulder joint has an additional rotational axis, the leg structure is reversed at the knee, and the musculature across the torso runs in lateral bands rather than the vertical striations that human anatomy uses. They are, by any reasonable measure, built for what the combat assessment track was designed to test. Rithek Velsavar was the cohort's senior officer cadet, 3 years into his track, assigned to conduct the orientation assessments for incoming cadets. He was 26 in Kavathi years, which is roughly comparable to a human 30, and he had the build and bearing of someone who had been assessed himself many times and had never been surprised by the result. He was not unkind. He was thorough, professional, and entirely certain of what he was looking at when he looked at me. He walked the cohort through the bay on that first morning, 12 stations, each covering a different assessment parameter, and gave a brief at each one in the clipped, precise Kavathi-accented compact, standard that senior cadets used when they were performing rather than speaking. At Station 1, he demonstrated the baseline physical measurement protocol, calm and impersonal, the way a good instructor always makes it clear the measurement is of the system and not of you. At Station 4, where the environmental response simulation ran, he paused to note a calibration issue with one of the gas mixture feeds and corrected it himself before moving on, which I noted, a detail person, someone who didn't delegate the small problems. The other 11 cadets in my cohort received nods or brief technical commentary at each station. When he reached me, at Station 7, the station for hand-to-hand combat evaluation, he paused. "Not long, a beat no more." "You're the human," he said. "Yes." "Place of training?" "None formal." "I have the prerequisite certifications from Earth." I had the list in the intake folder under my arm. I offered the folder. He did not take it. "No martial curriculum?" "No." He looked at me with an expression that was not contempt. Contempt would have required some animosity, and there was none. It was assessment. It was a machine reading a component and filing a result. The hand-to-hand component is 3 rounds on the sparring mat. Evaluation criteria are endurance, adaptation, and response calibration. The standard outcome for an unprepared cadet is a reclassification recommendation, observer track, 6-month orientation, re-entry to the assessment cohort in the next cycle. "I understand," I said. "The mat opens at 1400, he said. He moved to Station 8. I stood at Station 7 for a moment after he left. The woman at the adjacent station, a Kavathi cadet named Driveth Saul, who would turn out to be the sharpest tactical mind in our cohort, and would eventually be the person who wrote the letter that accompanied my certification, caught my eye and said nothing. She had dark blue-black scaling across her crest and the kind of stillness that reads as patience rather than disengagement. I did not know her yet. I noted the stillness and moved on. 1400 came after a morning of logistics briefings and equipment orientation, and a meal period in the station's common bay, where the food dispensers offered human-compatible options that were technically correct and texturally depressing. The way all nutritionally adequate food is when it has been formulated rather than made. I ate what was there and watched the other cadets and said little, which was my natural state, and which the other cadets read, accurately, as someone who did not yet know them well enough to talk. I arrived at the sparring bay at 1350. Rithek was already there. He had changed into assessment whites, the close-fitting gear that Kavathi combat specialists wore on the mat, which left most of the lateral musculature visible and moving. He was doing a warm-up sequence at the far end of the mat, a Kavathi form, fluid and very fast, a series of positions that flowed into each other with no visible pause. He did not acknowledge my arrival. The bay had 3 observation benches along the near wall, and the assessment panel, 2 senior instructors and the track coordinator, was settling into place as I crossed the floor to the equipment locker for my own gear. The gear fit. I had requested the smallest standard sizing, and it was close enough. The collar was tight in exactly the way the intake officer had predicted. I adjusted it and walked to my end of the mat. The mat itself was a surface I had not been on before, a firm composite that yielded slightly underfoot in a way that I had not anticipated and spent a few seconds calibrating. Not slippery, not soft. The kind of surface that was designed to be fair to both parties in the encounter, which meant it did not compensate for any disadvantage you brought to it yourself. Rithek came to center. He looked at me across the mat with the same assessing expression from orientation, and then, this is the thing I have turned over a great many times since, something shifted in it. Not toward contempt, toward something that resembled, very faintly, discomfort. As if the assessment result had already been filed and he had noticed a variable he hadn't accounted for but couldn't name. I don't know what he saw, I know what I felt. I felt nothing that would have alarmed anyone. I was not afraid. I was not angry. I was not braced against something. I was standing on a mat at the end of a very long journey, and all I needed to do was get through it, and I had been getting through things for as long as I could remember. The track coordinator called the first round. Rithek was better than me. I want to be clear about that because it matters to what comes next, not as a caveat, not as modesty, but as a structural fact that shaped everything about how the 3 rounds went. He was faster, stronger, technically superior in every formal parameter that the assessment criteria named, and he knew his own body with an intimacy that comes only from years of deliberate practice. In a straightforward contest, he would have ended the first round in under 40 seconds. He came at me immediately, no adjustment period, no read the opponent preliminary. He had already read the opponent and filed the result and was moving to conclusion. It was a standard Cavathi opening form, a sweep and close sequence that I later learned was the default first assessment move for any cadet who had not demonstrated a defensive response worth respecting. The logic was clean. Apply the standard form, observe the response, classify the cadet. I did not have a defensive response worth respecting in the formal sense. What I had was a different thing. When you have spent years living in a mechanical environment where the primary threats are physical, pressure events, temperature fluctuations, debris impacts, equipment failures, you develop a relationship with your body's alarm systems that is different from what formal combat training produces. Formal training builds responses. Stimulus A, response B. The deep spur relationship builds something older, a whole-body attunement to wrong, an awareness of when a situation has crossed a threshold you cannot afford, a reflex that is not trained but accumulated. You develop it without knowing you're developing it because you can't afford the learning period that formal training schedules. You develop it because the consequences of not having it are not a score on an assessment rubric, but a sealed environment that will no longer support you. I moved sideways, not the correct defensive form, not the Cavathi countermotion or the standard parry that the curriculum prescribed, just sideways, because the line of the sweep was wrong and sideways was where the not wrong was. I moved out of the sequence entirely, which was not what the form expected, and therefore not what Rithek had prepared to respond to. He recovered, he was good enough to recover. But there was a half-beat of recalibration, and in that half-beat I was behind him at an angle that was not, formally, advantageous, but was not where he had placed me either. He came back in. A different approach this time, a shoulder drive that would have closed the distance and taken me off my feet if it had landed correctly. I read the shoulder early, the way you read a pressure seal early, not because you have been trained to, but because you have been watching systems long enough that the pre-failure signature is recognizable before the failure occurs. I moved again, not gracefully. There was nothing graceful about what I was doing, but I was not where the impact was. He adjusted again. He tried a third approach, a feint and close that was more sophisticated than the first two, the kind of move that required the opponent to respond to the feint in order to be vulnerable to the close. I did not respond to the feint in any way that the form anticipated, because I had not been trained in the form, and therefore did not have the trained response that the feint was designed to draw. I moved to a position that was structurally wrong by the rubric standards, but that was simply not in the path of anything coming toward me. The round continued for 3 minutes and 40 seconds. He took me down twice. Both times I got back up and moved to a position that was not where he had put me. I did not score any formal contact points. I did not do anything the assessment rubric would have recognized as competent technique. I just kept being somewhere other than where the attack was. At the bell, Rithek stepped back and looked at me, and there was no more assessment machine quality in his expression. There was something else. Not respect, that comes later, if at all, and it is not a thing you get to name for yourself. Something more like the look a navigator gives when the chart says there is nothing here and the instruments are saying something else. The panel was very quiet. The second round was harder. He adjusted. That was the correct response, and he was skilled enough to do it, and the adjustment was intelligent. He stopped applying the standard form and started improvising, which meant the movement stopped being predictable in the ways that a trained response is predictable, and became the more organic randomness of a genuine adversary reading a genuine situation. He was also now angry in the precise, controlled way that very skilled practitioners get angry when something should have resolved and hasn't. Not a hot anger but a cold one, a narrowing of focus, a decision to stop giving the situation more credit than it deserved and simply end it. He moved faster. The first 2 approaches came in sequence, and the third was already present before I had fully processed the second, and the fourth was the one that landed. A body check that took my left arm and shoulder and rotated me off my feet and put me on the mat with enough force that the surface's designed yield felt, for a moment, like nothing at all. I lay on the mat for what the panel's record would later show was 4.1 seconds. My vision had a bright edge to it and my left shoulder was broadcasting a very specific kind of information. I cataloged the information. Left shoulder, impacted not structural, mobile in 2 of 3 axes. Vision, normal plus edge not indicative of anything that would change the calculus. Legs, available. Breathing, adequate. I got up. Rithek was standing 4 meters away, breathing evenly, watching. The expression on his face had changed again. There was something in it now that was neither the assessment machine quality nor the narrowed cold focus of the adjusted attack. There was something that I did not have a word for in Kavathi and only an approximate one in human. The expression of someone who has applied a conclusion and had the conclusion fail to close. He came again. 3 more times over the next 5 minutes, each approach better calibrated than the last, each one landing with more precision than the previous. He scored 5 contact points in the second round, which I would later learn was above the panel's expectation for a round against an untrained cadet. But after each point, after each moment where I was down and the mat was hard against my face, and my body was running its inventory and reporting back with results that were not optimal but were workable, I got up. For 8 minutes I lost ground steadily. He put me down 3 times. The third time, there was a moment on the way down where I had a choice about how I landed, and I made the correct choice, and I came up again, and Rithek stopped mid-advance and looked at me with an expression I could not fully read. "Why do you keep standing up?" he said. It was not a tactical question. It was not, I think, a question he meant to ask aloud. It slipped out the way things do when the model you have built does not match what you are observing, and your mind goes looking for the discrepancy. I didn't answer. Not because I was being strategic about it. I genuinely didn't know how to answer in a way that would fit inside the time we had. The honest answer was something like, because the mat is not the most hostile place I have ever been. Because I grew up in a place where the cost of not getting up was not a score on a rubric but something that cannot be reconsidered, and that calibration does not leave you just because you change the environment. Because there is a child in a resettlement system somewhere in the outer Duvari network who does not know whether I am coming, and I am not going to let a sparring mat be the thing that answers that question. That seemed like the wrong thing to say in the middle of an assessment round. So I said nothing, and after a moment Rithek came forward again. He scored 2 more contact points before the bell. I scored 1, not a formal technique, just a moment of proximity that I used, and that the panel logged, and that I couldn't have replicated on purpose. In the 3-minute rest between the second and third rounds, I sat on the bench at my end of the mat and tried to settle my breathing and assess what I had. I had taken a good deal of impact across my upper torso, and my left shoulder was moving with less precision than I would have liked. My vision was clear. My legs were reliable. The cut above my right eye, where the second round takedown had found the mat's edge, was bleeding in a slow, patient way. I blotted it with the back of my wrist, and it slowed but did not stop. My sense of where I was in space, which is the thing that does not leave you, the thing built by years of navigating a mechanical station in the dark, was intact. I thought about the cold side maintenance corridor. Not deliberately. It just came, the way certain memories come when you are tired and pressed and the ordinary logic of things has thinned to something elementary. The amber emergency lighting, the composite observation ports, the dead secondary rolling slowly in the dark below. Sieve's pale gold-gray face against the glass. The large Duvari eyes, not startled, watching. I thought, she is somewhere in a resettlement system, and she does not know if I am coming. She is 14 years older now, and she has been through a war, and she does not know if I am coming. I thought, get through the round. The third round went to 7 minutes and 12 seconds before the panel called it. Not because I was finished, because Rithek was. That is the part that I want to be precise about, because it is the part most likely to be misrepresented in the telling. He was not beaten in any formal sense. He was not injured. He did not fail. What happened was more specific. He had exhausted the available range of approaches. He had tried the standard form, the improvised attack, the pressure and close strategy, the attrition approach, the takedown and hold, all of them, all correctly executed, all applied with genuine skill. And at the end of 7 minutes and 12 seconds I was still standing on the mat, still roughly in the center of it, and he had run out of things to try that were producing a different outcome. The third round had been the most technically demanding of the 3, because he had stopped working from a template and started working from observation. He had watched how I moved in the first 2 rounds and built a model of the specific anomalies in my response pattern, the slight anticipation on right-side approaches, the half-step lag on cross moves, the particular quality of recovery after a hard landing that was different from what a trained cadet's recovery looked like, and he had applied that model with precision. He had found real weaknesses. He had exploited some of them. And I had kept moving, not gracefully, not efficiently, not in any way that a formal combat instructor would have pointed at as an example of good practice. But the deep spur reflex, the whole body attunement to wrong, the accumulated understanding of how to keep being present in a system that was actively working against you, did not distinguish between a pressure seal that was failing and an adversary that was pressing. Both of them required the same thing, which was, stay functional, stay present, take the next step. He stopped. He stepped back 2 paces. He was breathing hard. I was breathing hard too. My left shoulder was not going to feel good tomorrow. The cut above my right eye had gotten into the corner of my vision in a slow blinking way that is not dangerous but is distracting. My legs had started to have opinions about continued standing, and I was managing those opinions firmly. The panel called it. Rithek looked at me across the mat for a long moment. The assessment machine quality was entirely gone. What was there instead I still do not have a clean word for. It was not warm. The Kavathi do not, as a general rule, produce warm. But it was the look that a person gives when they have been wrong about something in a way that required them to revise a fundamental category, and they know it, and they are doing the revision in real time. "Where did you train?" he said. "I didn't," I said. "Then what is this?" I thought about the question. Not performing. I genuinely needed a moment to find the right language for something that had never needed language before, that had always just been the way things were. The way a deep spur engineer doesn't have a word for the specific alertness they bring to a pressure seal, because that alertness is just what you are, always, not a mode you switch to. It doesn't have a name until someone asks about it. Years, I said finally, in an environment that didn't care what I could or couldn't do. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said precisely, "What was the environment?" "A deep spur relay post," I said. "Far end of the Juvari network, 12 crew. My parents were the engineers." "How long?" "From infancy to 18. The assessment panel was not making any notes. They were watching. Drevith Saul, who had come in at some point in the second round and had taken a standing position at the back of the observation benches, was watching with her particular quality of patience. Rithek looked down at the mat for a moment, then back at me. "You're not fighting," he said. "You're surviving." "Yes," I said. "Those are different disciplines." "I know," I said. "I'm not here to fight." He absorbed that. It was the kind of statement that takes a moment to settle, because on first hearing it sounds like a concession, and on second hearing it's something else entirely. He looked at the mat again. He looked at the panel. He looked back at me once more, and whatever the revision was that he had been doing in real time appeared to have reached a conclusion, because the expression settled into something that was quieter and more deliberate than anything that had preceded it. "What are you here for?" he said. I did not answer that either. Not because the answer was secret. It was in my application materials, plainly stated, available to anyone who looked, but because the answer was not his to have in the way he was asking. It was mine. It was Steve's. It was a conversation between the two of us across 14 years and a resettlement system, and whatever the gap was between where I was standing and where she was, and I was not going to reduce it to a mat exchange. The track coordinator called the end of assessment. The review took 2.5 hours. I waited in a preparation room adjacent to the sparring bay, a low-ceilinged space with benches and a water dispensary, and the particular ambient hum of a station that is always processing something. My shoulder had been looked at by the bay medic, who was Juvari, who had the narrow hands and careful movements of his kind, and who assessed the damage as soft tissue impact, and told me in Juvari-accented compact, standard that it would need 3 days of restricted movement, and then it would be fine. I thanked him in Juvari. He paused and looked at me with the Juvari version of the look Rithek had given me on the mat, the recalibration look, and then he smiled, a small one, the contained kind, and said something in his own language that I was not quite fluent enough to catch all of. I caught the last word. It was the word for relay home, a Juvari compound that referred to a place that was not your birthplace but had become your bone place, the location that your nervous system recognized as the reference point from which all other places were measured. I sat in the preparation room with that word, and my aching shoulder, and the cut above my eye that had been cleaned and sealed, and was already beginning to forget it had been there. The water from the dispensary was exactly body temperature, which was either a calibration preference or a malfunction, and I drank it and did not care which. Drevith Saul came in at some point in the first hour. She sat on the bench across from me and said nothing for several minutes, which I respected. Then she said, "The panel is not reviewing whether you passed." "What are they reviewing?" "Which tier to place you in." I did not say anything. "The standard recommendation for a cadet who completes all 3 rounds without formal combat training is observer track provisional," she said. Rithek's assessment, I read it. He submitted it during the break, recommends Tier 2 direct entry. I was quiet for a moment. That's not standard. It's not. The panel is deciding whether his recommendation is consistent with the assessment criteria or whether it represents a deviation. She paused. It is consistent. The criteria allow for it. It's just never happened before. What's the argument against? That the evaluation was an endurance demonstration rather than a combat competence demonstration, and that endurance without technique is not what the Tier 2 track is designed to develop. She said this without inflection. She was reporting the argument's existence, not endorsing it. And the argument for that adaptation under unstructured adversarial pressure is a primary Tier 2 competency, and that you demonstrated it under conditions that most Tier 2 cadets would not encounter for 6 months of supervised training. She paused again. Rithek's letter uses the phrase operating principle. He says you have one. He says he cannot identify what it is, but that it is stable and consistent and does not degrade under sustained pressure. She looked at me with her patient stillness. That is a significant thing for Rithek Vel-Savar to put in a formal assessment letter. I thought about Rithek on the mat. The way the assessment machine quality had gone and something more human, more Kavathi, perhaps, maybe those are the same thing, had taken its place. The revision happening in real time, the question he hadn't meant to ask out loud. Is he the one arguing for the Tier 2 placement? He is the only one arguing for it, yes. I thought about that. I thought about the look on his face at the end of the third round, not warm, not friendly, but revised. A machine that had filed a wrong result and was doing the correction with the same precision it applied to everything else. The intake clerk who had looked at my childhood field and filed it away without comment. The Juvari medic and the word relay home. All of them doing the same thing, which was taking in information that didn't fit the model and adjusting the model. Quietly. Without drama. Because that was what you did when the instrument said something the chart hadn't predicted. He didn't have to do that, I said. No, she said, he didn't. The room was quiet for a while. From somewhere deeper in the station came the low mechanical hum of something cycling, a pressure system, a relay array, the ordinary deep machine breathing of a space installation going about its maintenance. I had grown up with that sound. It had been the ambient condition of everything, the constant beneath every other constant, and for a moment sitting in that preparation room I was in the cold side corridor again, the amber light, the observation ports, Sieve pressing her face against the cold composite and watching the dead secondary below. Driveth said, why Tier 2? Not 1, why not complete the standard track and exit at Level 1 certification? Level 1 gives me a compact Class C transit clearance, I said. Tier 2 gives me Class B. The difference is access to civilian resettlement records, Juvari welfare system records. She had done the research. I was not surprised. The stillness I had observed in her from the beginning was the stillness of a mind that was always working. Yes, I said. She nodded once. Not the nod of someone who had gotten the answer they expected, the nod of someone who had needed to verify that the answer was what it was. How long has she been in the system? 14 months since I started tracking, longer than that since the evacuation. Driveth was quiet, then she said, what was her name? I told her. The sound of the station breathed around us. Outside the preparation room, somewhere in the review bay, the panel was deciding. We did not speak again for a long time, and it was not an uncomfortable silence. It was the silence of two people who had said what needed to be said and were letting it settle. I thought that Driveth Saul was probably the kind of person who understood something about what needed to be said and when to stop saying it, and that this was related to the quality of stillness she had. Not absence, attention. At some point, she said, the probationary period is 8 weeks. I know. The technical curriculum runs concurrent with the assessment track. It's rigorous. I'll do it. She looked at me for a moment. You're not asking me whether the placement is likely to be confirmed. The placement is either confirmed or it isn't, I said. I'll do the 8 weeks either way. The work is the same. She nodded again. This one was different, slower, more deliberate, the nod of someone making a filing. They called me in at 2 hours and 41 minutes. The 3 panel members were behind a long table in a room that was calibrated for formality, clean surfaces, minimal furnishing, the light angled to place the panel in slight shadow and the cadet in slight brightness, which I noted and adjusted to without comment. The track coordinator was center. The 2 senior instructors flanked her. The track coordinator was a Kavathi female named Velith Orar, old enough to have the crest fade that comes at the later career stages, with the deliberate voice of someone who had said important things to a great many people, and had long since stopped trying to make them sound more important than they were. "Cadet Strand," she said. "Ma'am." The panel has reviewed the combat assessment documentation, including the observing assessment officer's recommendation. A pause. The deliberation has been more extensive than is customary. "I understand." The assessment officer's recommendation identifies several criteria that are categorically unusual for a first-day evaluation. The panel is in agreement that the criteria are correctly applied. She paused again, and this pause had a different quality, the quality of a person who is giving something weight before setting it down. The disagreement has been whether the criteria, correctly applied, produce the result the assessment officer recommends. I waited. "There is a procedural argument," she said, "that the evaluation was observationally inconsistent, that what was assessed was not a combat competency but a behavioral characteristic, and that behavioral characteristics are not subject to tier classification under the current rubric." "I understand the argument," I said. She looked at me. "You anticipated it." "The argument is correct in a narrow sense," I said. "What was assessed was not a formal combat competency. I don't have a formal combat competency." "Then you're arguing against your own placement." "I'm acknowledging that the procedural argument is legitimate," I said. "I'm not arguing against the placement. I'm saying the placement depends on whether the rubric is intended to measure competency as a set of techniques or competency as a functional outcome." The 2 senior instructors were very still. "Continue," Velith Orar said. "The Tier 2 track is designed to develop cadets for frontier extraction environments. In those environments, you encounter conditions that the training rubric cannot anticipate. The rubric measures whether a cadet has the techniques to respond to the conditions the track teaches." "That is a valid measure." I kept my voice level, not aggressive, not performing. This was the clearest thing I had thought through in the 2.5 hours in the preparation room, and I was giving it to them as cleanly as I could. What the assessment officer identified is a separate measure, whether a cadet has the internal architecture to function when the techniques run out. Those 2 measures are not the same thing. One of them requires the Tier 2 track to develop. The other one is either present or absent. I paused. The procedural argument assumes the rubric is only measuring the first kind of competency. The assessment officer is arguing it should be measuring both. Velith Orar looked at me for a long time. "You've read the rubric," she said. "It was in the intake materials." She looked at the instructor to her left, then the one to her right. Something passed between them that was not speech. "The panel," she said carefully, "has reached a conditional resolution." She picked up the documentation in front of her. "Conditional placement on the Tier 2 track for a probationary period of 8 weeks. At the end of the probationary period, a formal competency evaluation using standard Tier 2 criteria. If the evaluation result meets the tier standard, placement is confirmed. If it does not, reclassification to the standard track." She set the documentation down. "The condition is that you complete the Tier 2 combat technique curriculum concurrently with the assessment track. The technical deficit is real and must be addressed." "I accept," I said. "There is a note in the panel record," she said, "for the permanent file." She looked directly at me. "The assessment officer's characterization, operating principle, stable, consistent, does not degrade under sustained pressure, will be retained. It is an unusual notation. The panel considers it accurate. I had nothing to say to that. I said, "Thank you." She nodded. Your intake file notes a childhood residence on a Duvari relay post. Waystation Vale 3, Deep Spur 7. The installation was evacuated during the Spur conflict. Yes. The panel has no questions about that, she said, except to note that it is relevant context for the assessment record. She paused. Is there anything further you need to say for the record? I thought about Sieve. The relay acknowledgement, 2 fingers raised in the docking bay. The thing she had known that I had known that neither of us had said, which was that the distance between us was going to be very large for a very long time, but that it was not permanent, and that the signal, when it came, would be received. No, I said, thank you. The transit authorization came through 11 days later. Compact Class B clearance, provisional under the Tier 2 probationary placement, active for 8 weeks. Enough to file a records inquiry with the Duvari welfare system. Enough to get an address, a contact point, a name on a file that was not marked as unresolved. I filled out the inquiry form in the station's communications bay at 2 in the morning, when the bay was empty and the machinery made its quiet maintenance sounds, and the light above the terminal was the amber shade of emergency lighting in a deep spur corridor. I don't know if I chose that time deliberately. I don't think it matters. The form took 11 minutes to complete. I submitted it. In 26 hours, I had a response. Not a resolution. Resettlement cases do not resolve in 26 hours, but a case number, an assigned coordinator, and a record entry that had been updated as of the previous month to note that the subject was in a supervised welfare placement at a facility in the outer Duvari network. Health status stable, current residency secure. No contact information. The coordinator would handle that through proper channels. Proper channels. I had been through enough of them to understand what that meant in terms of time. Weeks, most likely. Possibly months. There were forms to file and processes to follow, and every one of them was legitimate and necessary, and I was going to follow all of them exactly. I had 8 weeks of probationary training. After that, if I held the tier, I had a Class B clearance that did not expire. After that, there was the rest of the certification path, Level 2 frontier extraction, the actual work, the environmental assessments and the retrieval protocols and the specific, grinding, practical business of going to hard places and getting to the people who were in them. I had time, not infinite time, but the kind that is sufficient if used correctly. The kind you learn to trust when you've spent years in an environment that is not hostile to you personally, but is indifferent in ways that have the same practical consequences. I closed the terminal and walked back to my bunk through the station's nighttime corridors, where the lighting was amber and low, and the mechanical systems made their familiar sounds. The corridor ran past a section of outer hull where there was a single observation port, smaller than the ones in the cold side maintenance corridor at Vale 3, but made of the same thick composite, and I stopped and pressed my face against it. The dead secondary was below. Not the same one, a different system, a different orbit, but the same category of thing. Very large, very old, very quiet, rolling in the dark on a path it had been traveling for longer than any of us would be capable of measuring. The relay array's glow caught it on one side. The rest was dark. I looked at it for a while. She knows I'm coming. Not because I had sent any message. I hadn't, not yet, not until the coordinator cleared it. But because she has known since the docking bay, since the 2 fingers raised in relay acknowledgement, since the signal confirmed received. That is what the gesture means precisely. Not I have heard you, but I have received you, which is different, which is the difference between a sound and a fact. Some things you don't pick apart. The station breathed around me. I walked through it the way I had walked through a station since I was old enough to walk anywhere, knowing where the pressure seals were, and which passages ran warm and which ran cold, knowing the sound of a system that was working and the different sound of a system that was not, knowing that the distance between where I was and where I was going was large but not permanent. I had made it through the round. I had made it through the round, and the mat was behind me, and the rest of it was just the work.